Believe it or not, there is a fairly heated discussion going on certain online blogs about this little piece of plastic I have around my neck right here. The clerical collar, the Roman collar, the dog collar, this little thing that we priest types wear. Apparently, this sweaty, uncomfortable little piece of plastic is one of Anglicanism's many gifts to Christendom, to the world of the church. Prior to the 19th century, just a little history lesson here. Prior to the 19th century, English and American parish clergy pretty much dressed like any other respectable gentleman. There was no special uniform. They were expected to be sober and modest in dress, and when you read clergy guides, it talks about being sober and modest and not being flashy. But there was no special uniform for their street clothes. They would wear their vestments when they were doing worship, typically cassock and surplice, but they wouldn't wear anything special out in the street. But at that time, in the early 19th century and the late 18th century, the high starched collar was just standard gentleman's wear. It was just what gentlemen wore. For example, if you've got a single dollar bill in your wallet, look at the picture of George Washington. He's wearing this very high collar of linen that's wrapped around with the two ends hanging down. That was just fashion. That didn't have anything to do with whether you were ordained or not. But then around 1840 and the kind of the middle of the 19th century, there was this move, this idea that the church needed to set the clergy apart somehow. Whether you think that's right or wrong, and we'll get into that later. The idea was that the clergy were too much like everybody else. They were too much like just nice country gentlemen, and they needed to be set apart a little bit. So just at this point in the mid-19th century, when fashion was changing, when gentlemen were wearing big black silk cravats or colored silk cravats, if you've got a $20 picture of Andrew Jackson for sort of mid-19th century fashion, clergy decided that they were intentionally going to set themselves apart by wearing fashion, by wearing what was out, what had been the fashion 20 years before. They decided to set themselves apart by being dorky, essentially, by wearing old fashions. So this white collar, the plain white collar, was adopted as a way for clergy to identify themselves, specifically in the Church of England. Believe it or not, it got picked up by a lot of the other traditions, including the Roman Catholic tradition. This is one of the few times, I think, where something started in the Anglican Church and moved to the Roman Catholic Church. And Roman Catholics would typically wear the collar with their cassock over the top with that turned up black collar so that only a little square of white showed in the front. Okay, fast forward 150 years. The collar is typically now plastic. I know a few clergy who still buy linen collars and starch them and press them, but I'm not one of them. So it's either a plastic ring around your neck that buttons in the back or front, or that little white plastic tab that fits into a black shirt to make it look like that white collar with the cassock turned up around it. Okay. A lot of information about the collar that you probably never needed to know or never care about again. And it's not really the collar itself that's important, but what I think is interesting is the arguments about it online. On the one hand, you have the people who say, the last thing we want to do right now is do anything that emphasizes a separation between the clergy and the laity. We're preaching about the priesthood of all believers and the priesthood of the baptized. Why would we want to do something that sets apart one group, that separates the professional from the other Christians and sort of makes some sort of barrier? Why would we want to do that? On the other hand, there are the folks that argue that this little piece of plastic is actually a kind of a public witness. That when folks see somebody in public wearing a collar, it changes the way they think. It makes them realize, number one, that there are still people who do this, that the church is still around, that there are still priests. It maybe makes them think about their own faith a little bit. And I can tell you from my experience and from an experience I've heard from a lot of other priests, there is something about the collar that even for people of a very Protestant background or a non-Christian background, it makes them feel like they to you. People will come up to you in airports and restaurants and want to give confession sometimes because they've been carrying something around, and then they see that collar, and it's like the Golden Arches or the Howard Johnson sign. It's something comfortable that they understand and know. So, arguments on both sides. Now, those of you who know me pretty well know that I typically only wear the collar on Sunday morning, right? If you come by here during the week, I'm usually not in the collar. And I actually have this little conversation with myself in my head. Am I doing that because I feel so strongly about the priesthood of all believers, feel so strongly that we shouldn't do anything to set the clergy apart? Or am I doing it because I'm a little bit uncomfortable with being so conspicuous, with being so vulnerable, with being out in the world with something around my neck that says, this guy is a professional Christian? Now, oftentimes I will wear it on hospital visits. Some of you who have seen me in the hospital know that I'll wear it on hospital visits. And I tell myself it's because it makes certain people comfortable that when someone walks into the room that is identified as a clergy person, they have this collar so that they know who that person is. But I'm also aware that when I walk into a hospital, especially a Roman Catholic hospital wearing a collar, I'm likely to get a little different kind of respect than if I walk in my jeans and my polo shirt. I don't necessarily do it for that reason, but I'm aware that I get that little extra bit of respect. And I have to confess that sometimes I wear the collar in public occasions if I want to draw attention, if I want to sort of make a little bit of a deal out of the fact that I'm there as a clergy person, like at the Pride Festival. I think it was probably more of a deal for me to be in the booth in a clerical collar, no matter how uncomfortable that was on that hot day, than for me to be there in a polo shirt. Or I will wear it sometimes, quite honestly, where I don't mind getting the benefit of the doubt and being thought of, making the impression right away as a good and honest person. Like if I'm testifying in court, I might tend to wear the collar and have everybody know who I am. I don't usually use the title Father. Some people call me that. I don't usually introduce myself as Father. I don't usually introduce myself as the Reverend, unless I'm vouching for somebody with his parole officer. I mean, I'm willing to use that little extra bit of juice if it's going to do some good, if it's going to impress somebody, if it's going to make them think a particular way about me. I'm not crazy about everything that goes with the uniform and the title, but I'm aware that they have their uses in the world. And that's why this passage from Matthew is so threatening to a lot of us clergy folk. I mean, even if we're not wide phylactery, long fringe types, there is something a little bit threatening because we all like to be respected. We all like to be honored a little bit. We all like to have everybody notice who we are. We like to be catered to a little bit. We like to be taken care of because we're special. An older priest friend once told me, in the old days, I couldn't pay for a haircut or a cup of coffee in this town. You know, that was back in the days when the clergy person automatically got free coffee and a free haircut. Well, I can tell you unequivocally those days are over, at least in Lexington and at least in Indianapolis. A younger clergy friend told me recently that she has discovered that her clerical collar gets her out of more speeding tickets than a low-cut blouse ever did. I don't know if that would work for me. I haven't tried that yet. Now, we may tell ourselves that this is just tradition, that this is just something we do because people expect it of us, but the fact is that, as the people on the blog say, titles like Father and Reverend and special uniforms do set the clergy apart. They do create the impression that there's this sort of power differential between those of us who get paid to be ministers and those of us who are ministers because that is our calling as baptized Christians. It sets up this differentiation. I remember someone telling me half jokingly in a church where I was helping them to design the worship space that the rule is the more clothes you have on and the more steps you have to go up to get to your chair, the closer you are to God. And that brings us to the other danger in wide phylacteries and long fringes, the one that Jesus calls the Pharisees on. Because no matter how much we preach from the pulpit that we're all beloved of God, no matter how much we preach that God shows no partiality among his people, no matter how much we preach that we're all sinners in need of grace, there is this persistent assumption, this persistent expectation that ordained people are nicer. That ordained people are purer, that ordained people are somehow better Christians than other Christians, that ordained people are closer to God. Well, I think everybody in this room knows that's not true. I know it's not true, and Bob makes a point of reminding me on an almost daily basis that it's not true. But there is something about these expectations, the expectations about how clergy are supposed to behave, clergy are supposed to speak, clergy are supposed to do things. There are expectations about the way clergy are supposed to drive a car, apparently. I will admit that I have occasionally been known to get impatient behind the wheel of the car. I will admit that I have occasionally verbally questioned the intelligence of drivers whose driving does not live up to my standards. I've maybe even questioned their parentage, or I have occasionally expressed my frustration with the use of the horn or certain hand gestures that we don't need to go into here. And if I'm doing that wearing a t-shirt, I'm just making an ass of myself. But if I'm doing it wearing a clerical collar, I know that whether I mean to or not, I'm in some way representing the church. I'm in some way representing all of you. And I know that folks are holding me to a different standard. I know that if I stop in the Speedway store on the way home from church to pick up cigarettes for Bob, I feel funny buying cigarettes in a collar, and I will sometimes take it off and leave it on the front seat before I go in. What's that about? If I pass a beggar on the street and shrug my shoulders when he asks me for money, whatever I tell myself about not enabling antisocial behavior and teaching people to be self-sufficient, I know that if I'm dressed as a priest, it's not just me that's disappointing him. He's going to apply that disappointment to the whole church. So if people treat clergy folk with some kind of deference, if when I walk into a hospital there's an assumption of goodwill, it's because people expect clergy to live up to a higher standard. And when they don't, that discrepancy can be devastating. You see, Jesus isn't just calling the religious leaders out for being showy about their piety. It's not just a matter of long fringes and wide phylacteries. For Jesus, the problem is the difference between what we teach and what we actually do. The difference between what we know to be right and how we actually live our lives. Between what we show off to the world and what we do when we think no one is looking. It's the difference between the talk we talk and the walk we walk. That, for Jesus, is the real problem. And that's not just a problem for religious leaders. It's not just a problem for people in collars. How many people here have a church sticker on their car or WWMD paint on their car? Okay? How many people have a St. Martha's t-shirt that they wear in public from time to time? How many people have a cross that they wear in public? Okay? How many of you are conscious that this means that the world is holding you to a higher standard? How many of you are aware that the world is watching you for signs of hypocrisy when they see you representing the church that way? How many of you are going to go out to the parking lot after this service and scrub down your car to get rid of those letters? This sort of inconsistency can be a stumbling block to folks who are outside the church and looking at the church from outside. They see people who identify themselves as Christians behaving badly, and they decide, well, the whole shebang is hypocritical. The whole thing is not worth my time. And if this turns people away from the church, that's unfortunate. That's tragic. But that's not even what Jesus is so worked up about. See, God created us for wholeness. God created us for shalom. God created us for integrity. And God created us so that we could live in accord with God's will. God created us so that our will and God's will could be one. God created us so we could live the way we've been taught to live, and so that there's no discrepancy between what we say and what we do. And as long as there's this inconsistency between what we say and what we do, we can never be happy. As long as there's this inconsistency between our will and God's will, we can never be whole. The fact is, on our own, we can't overcome this inconsistency, no matter how long our fringes are, how wide our phylacteries are. It's not something we can do. So far, Jesus is the only human being who has been able to live in this kind of wholeness, this kind of shalom, this kind of integrity with what he preaches and how he lives exactly in accord. And as hard as it is to remember sometimes, we're not Jesus. But by walking in integrity, Jesus makes it possible for us to walk toward integrity. By living in accordance with God's will, Jesus makes it possible for us to strive for God's will. By being willing to die before he would live any other way, Jesus reconciles the discrepancies and inconsistencies of the whole world. By rising again in that great, unexpected, shocking mystery of the resurrection, Jesus overcomes death for all of us and makes it possible for us to begin to live in the way that we teach. Amen.